Hello and welcome to another National Road Safety Partnership Program, APA Group's case study on safety culture in a H&S strategy. My name is Jerome Carslake. If you can just flick across the next slide, please, Keith. And I manage the NRSP and its many activities. There I am. To find out more about the NRSP, please go to our website, register for the newsletter, and you'll be kept informed of this and many other things which are up and coming. So today's session, it's going to go for approximately 60 minutes. Next slide, please, Keith. And what we'll have throughout is plenty of time for discussion. We have two points where we'll actually hold for questions as well, if needed, and we've got plenty of question slide at the end. We're going to be recording today's session. It'll be shared through the NRSP website, and an email will go out afterwards, just basically outlining where the link is, and the PowerPoint will be available as well. So we do love to make these as interactive as possible, so we'd love your input. If you can just go to the next slide, please. What you can do is send through your questions by typing them into the question box here. Please keep them short and sharp, and I'll aim to ask them at a right point if they and Keith may have touched on it later on during the webinar. So we're very, very lucky. You've already heard me mention his name a couple of times. We're very lucky to have Keith Hoskins from APA Group on board today. Welcome, Keith.
Yeah, thanks, Jerome, and good afternoon all.
And looking forward to really diving in, hearing your story. I know, Keith, you've been part of our utilities forum and a passionate person around sharing basically the things you're doing in safety. So I'm really looking forward to diving in and hearing about what you're doing today at the moment and where things are going at APA Group. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jerome. What I might do first of all is just give an overview to the audience in terms of APA. Webinars are a little bit, I suppose, in terms of webinar, I can't get to see the audience, so I can't see the reaction and so forth, but we'll give it a good go through, in terms of this presentation today. So look, just a little bit about APA. So we're a top 50 ASX listed company in Australia. As it was on LinkedIn, Jerome posted some information on LinkedIn around APA. So we have over 15,000 kilometres of gas transmission pipeline. We also have gas storage facilities around Australia, and we also have power generation, being gas power generation, and recently we've moved into renewables in terms of solar and wind. And we also own high voltage interconnectors, being Murray Link and Direct Link from South Australia and Victoria. And recently we moved into midstream gas processing, so that's a big facility we're building down at Orbost. And we have a couple of major hazard facilities. So pretty much we are, in terms of an organisation or an industry, we're in a high risk environment. And I suppose it goes without saying, in terms of when you look at safety, health and safety in a high risk environment, safety culture is absolutely critical in terms of managing your assets, managing your people and keeping your people safe. Just also in terms of our people, we travel to probably some of the remote parts of Australia, and we travel in approximately 15 million kilometres an hour. So a lot of our technicians and so forth travelling into isolated and pretty much very remote parts of Australia. So that's a little bit about APA. So I always say, with a presentation, start with the why, and why is it so important in terms of safety culture, in terms of when you're positioning it into a strategy. And I always sort of say that, basically, if you don't consider safety culture, and every organisation has its own safety culture, and that may be in terms of its maturity, could be at quite a reactive sort of environment, or could be quite, in terms of maturity, could be quite interdependent or degenerative, in terms of that maturity. You've probably also heard the term culture eats strategy for breakfast. So there's no use having a really good strategy if you haven't addressed the culture part. There's been plenty of examples and significant events that have occurred over the years that have resulted in public inquiries, royal commissions, and these have involved events that have basically, of organisations in a lot of cases that have quite well matured HSE, health, safety, environment management systems, and including insurance programs. And then we look in terms of outside of probably health and safety. In Australia recently, we had the Royal Commission into the Royal Commission into the financial sector. And the findings from that Royal Commission basically were really around the culture and how the financial sector were managing their non-financial risks. So I think it goes without saying, some organisations say we have a good safety culture, but I say, if it's good, then good, think about this, good is the enemy of great. So if you want a great safety culture, you really got to go beyond just thinking that we have got a pretty good safety culture in our organisation. What's getting in the road or what's stopping it from being great? So that's our sort of, as an organisation, what we sort of put up as a bit of I suppose, a vision is we want to be, as an organisation, world leaders in terms of responsible energy. And that sort of helps us push us along in terms of that vision of being great. A couple of events here in terms of some significant events that have happened, some in Australia and some outside of Australia. We won't have time today to go through all of these in any great detail, but I think I might call out a couple of them. The first one there, the Deep Sea Horizon, so the Macondo well. So back in 2010, obviously one that, there's been a Hollywood movie made after it. There's been a lot of publicity in relation to the Deepwater Horizon. But 5 years prior to that, there was an accident in BP in terms of the Texas refinery explosion where 15 workers were killed. So 5 years before the Deepwater Horizon, they did a fairly extensive investigation. And some of the things they found in that investigation were around safety culture, organisational design, in terms of cost cutting, poor maintenance processes and so forth. And then 5 years later, they have the Deepwater Horizon, which was 11 fatalities and a major environmental disaster for BP. Now, BP were probably lucky to survive that event. Their share price tanked and it has never really recovered, but they were very probably lucky to survive it. And then in our own backyard, we have Dreamworld. And Dreamworld was an interesting one. In 2016, the Thunder River Rapid Ride, where 4 innocent people lost their lives. And as part of the coroner's inquiry into that event, we hear things like the person that was on the operating panel on the day was a young lady, and she'd never ever received any training around emergency procedures, and she didn't even know where the emergency stop button was. And then we also then hear that basically people were told never to use the emergency stop button. If they ever had to stop the ride, they were to use the control panel, which took a lot longer to stop the ride. And then also came out of it in terms of cost cutting, in terms of their maintenance procedures and so forth. And it's an interesting one because we, in our own organisation, we use Dreamworld as something to sort of ask our people, in the event of a situation where safety, where you felt we're at risk, would you stop work? And in our employee opinion surveys, we asked this question, do you feel that you're safe, you'll be able to stop work in a situation where your safety is potentially going to be compromised? And people say yes. But the next question we asked is, have you ever done it? And what we found is we didn't find a person that came forward and said they actually had done it. So that actually told us something that potentially in our own organisation, we could have that Dreamworld situation where someone didn't feel confident and so forth of pushing that emergency stop button. And the third one, the last one I'll profile here, is the Boeing 737 MAX. So this is still ongoing in terms of the investigation, but 2 major air disasters killing a total of 346 people. And in relation to the 737 MAX, so this was a modified aircraft. It wasn't a new aircraft from Boeing. And being a modified aircraft, they put new engines onto it, and they were able to get the air certification without going through it being a new aircraft. As part of putting the new engines on it, they realized that the nose, when they were flying this aircraft, was basically tilting down. So they introduced a sensor to correct that. And basically what we hear is that when they introduced that sensor on both of these two flights, there was catastrophic failure of that sensor that put the aircraft into a nosedive. So people flying on that aircraft were in a flying coffin, basically. And we hear that Boeing had never ever publicised anything around the sensors. There was no training, there was no manuals, there was no nothing. So we also now hear, as part of the Congress in America, that there's actual criminal charges now being taken against directors of Boeing, and there's cause for the CEO in terms of him to stand down. So look, I think without going through all these events, but it gives you a bit of a flavour of why safety culture is so important, because each one of these, when you look back in hindsight bias, safety culture is a feature, and safety culture is definitely prominent in each one of these. The next slide here is a bit of a bold statement, but I'd ask the audience, how many investigations have you come across that you were really surprised by the findings? I know from my own experience, and having worked in high-risk industries for a number of years and for large organisations, I don't think I can actually recall an investigation where I was absolutely surprised by the findings. And the other thing, I think, in terms of when you look at investigations, I could probably name so many investigations I've picked up and started to read through the investigation, and it's really getting to that punitive blame situation in terms of the cause. So it comes back to the investigation methodology and applying it, ensuring that independent people are involved in the investigation. We're asking the 5 whys. One of the models that we use in APA, we've started to use, is the Just Culture model, which is independent from the business, to really apply a model in terms of getting to the bottom of it. We don't want to just get to the fact that we're looking at blaming people and so forth. It's not to say that in some instances we do need to take action or consequences against people, but I don't think I've got a record in all my career where I've come across someone directly causing an accident where they've actually gone out of their way to cause it. So I think, in terms of investigation outcomes and so forth, it's an area that within APA that we put a lot of focus in terms of our investigations and really getting to those 5 whys and actually getting to the heart of the problem.
Oops.
The next statement, another bit of a bold statement, but if safety management doesn't go beyond systems and processes, it will come extinct. I think a lot of cases in organisations, and I can talk from experience, where safety management systems and processes have become so bureaucratic, it's become so complex that they're they're disconnected in terms of the organisation, in terms of the risk profile of the organisation. So they're actually really sort of reflecting work or how things happen in an imagined state rather than how work is really done. So in APA, one of the simple models we use in the organisation, we use a small framework called the Risk Control Assure. Very simple, very easy to understand. And that's about understanding in terms of what's the risk here, what's the risk we're trying to manage, and what are our controls and how adequate are our risk controls in terms of prevention. And then what are we doing in terms of assuring in terms of that process. So my point here that I'm making is that we all probably work in organisations that got safety management systems, but I'd ask you to just go back and say, well, how relevant are these safety management systems? Are you relying on things like certification and all those sorts of self-insurance that comes along and really sort of drives into detail? But in actual fact, how relevant is your safety management system? How is it being used? How is it being applied? And is it, sort of really well known within the business? And people can actually refer back to things within your safety management system. Any questions?
Yep, I got one here from Matthew. And sorry, Ron, you've just pointed out there might be some sound problems. Is that correct? I hope not. Matthew is just asking here, how do you make sure employees and workers don't become complacent?
Yeah, look, I think this goes back to safety culture in terms of leadership. Employees will come complacent where leadership don't take a real interest and actually are committed to it. So if the leaders are not walking the talk and directly really engaging with their people, and also holding people accountable and clearly in terms of what people are accountable for, then generally complacency will start to find its way. So that leadership part, that felt leadership and actually getting out there is extremely important, especially in high risk organizations. And the other thing is around, quality assurance, in terms of having good quality assurance programs and doing what we call our lead indicators. So our safety leadership sort of engagements that we do within the organization, and also the two-way feedback. So giving opportunity for employees to also feedback, because if there's something's not right or we need to change something, then we need to hear that. So I think that sort of gets to the heart of that complacency, because complacency breeds content, and we know generally what happens in that situation.
That's great. Caroline's got an interesting query for you here to comment on. I remember a cynical safety officer saying there were so many protocols and safety measures that people stopped thinking for themselves, and that is what was unsafe today. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the point I was making around safety management systems, where they've become so bureaucratic in organisations. And that can be in, for example, I mentioned in our APA, we have major hazard facilities that are highly regulated, and we have, regulators coming in. We work in a highly regulated environment, but it really comes back to, this little model that I just mentioned around the risk control ashore and keeping things simple, because sometimes things get created and procedures get created to actually meet an outcome or corrective action. And then you say, well, is that the right response? Is that what we really need to do? And then I always question, how competent are your workforce? Are we creating procedures because we've got an incompetent workforce? Have we invested the training in our people to be competent? So in the end of the day, a lot of procedures get developed because I think it comes back to the fact that we have a workforce that's not competent, so we've got to develop a procedure so they become competent and follow procedures. So yeah, it's a very good question, and it's one I think we've really got to challenge within our own organisations, so we don't fall into that situation where it becomes complex bureaucracy, etc.
And I remember one of the partners mentioning how they were stripping back a lot of their policies and processes and really streamlining everything, because there was so many in place, it all became noise and everyone sort of got lost in what they should do.
Yeah, look, I always, say that, it's really, a system's got to be fit for purpose. If it's not fit for purpose, it's not about just simplifying. It's easy to make things quite complex, but I think it's harder to make things fit for purpose. And that's the challenge we have in APA, because we have got some of that in our own organisation. And as part of our new strategic plan is starting to strip back and make things fit for purpose. And that is a challenge in itself, because it's changing its culture as well, because you're changing things and changing things that, for example, if you've got a lot of engineers in your business, I tell you what, engineers just love the detail. I'm not insulting any engineers out there that might be on the call, but they do love the detail and love the that process side of things. And not saying we throw the baby out the bathwater, but that fit for purpose and actually making sure it's doing what it's intended to do.
I think that's a great point. I've got a last question here before we move on, which can sort of draw on that a little bit as well. How do we achieve knowledge transfer through intergenerational change in safety culture? DuPont has achieved it through their STOP program. How are general managers made to adopt safety as a value, something they are not prepared to leave their house without?
Yeah, look, I think once again, it's not something, it's like flicking a switch and it just happens. It's a whole program around the safety culture piece, and in ensuring that leaders have the necessary tools and the competency, and they're actually become more like coaches with our people, and that's really important, in the sense you can't expect every leader to have all the technical competencies, but they need to be able to identify where some things are, perhaps gaps or so forth within their own, work teams and so forth, and that you know, the change in generation in terms of, you know, new younger workers. I think it's also really recognising, you know, that younger workers are really sort of vulnerable in the sense that they're at higher risk because they don't have the experience and they don't have, you know, all the collective knowledge and wisdom that more of a senior, you know, person working industry for a while. So you really need to also make sure, for example, you're bringing apprentices or young workers into your workforce, that you have a program that actually picks up or addresses young workers' needs. You know, for example, we've got apprenticeship programs and graduate programs in our organisation, and we really, you know, in terms of setting up that framework, you know, for that younger generation coming into our business, and how we're actually going to also make sure that, you know, they are, you know, protected in the sense that, you know, we're not putting them into situations where they could be in a high risk situation.
Great. Well, Richard is an engineer online, and he fully agrees with you and takes no offence at all. So, well, now I think we can move forward. Thanks, Keith.
My background is engineering anyway, so I'm insulting myself. Okay, so just moving on, and this is sort of getting into, I suppose, a bit of a case study within APA. So, in terms of safety culture, and I think, you know, it's really important when we sort of look at safety culture. If you look at the wide web, you'll find various and many definitions of it. So I just want to touch on that and spend a couple of minutes on that. I want to sort of introduce you to a model called the Safety Climate of Hierarchy of Controls, which is quite a useful model. And then I want to sort of look at the main reasons for APA. Why did we all of a sudden, you know, sort of say, well, hang on, have we got the culture right within our organisation? Is there more to do? And if so, what are we going to do about it? I want to sort of touch on in terms of our strategy. So in actual fact, we've just launched a new strategy, which is integrated now into our business strategy. So previously our HSE strategy was a standalone strategy, but we've just actually relaunched a new strategy, which is actually business owned, which is a big shift. Also, I want to sort of touch on in terms of, you know, the approach we've undergone and still undergoing in terms of safety culture. So it is a journey. I don't think there's ever a real destination, to be quite honest. It's always constantly challenging and looking at doing things better, but also acknowledging where new risks come into the organisation, how we deal with those new risks. The tools and measures that we're applying in terms of our journey, and last of all, health and wellbeing in terms of our strategy, what we're doing in that area, which is quite an important part of our strategy. So to start off, what is safety culture? As I said, you get on the web and you do a search, and you know, you get all sorts of descriptors around safety culture. Things like, for example, it's generally how the organisation sort of operates. It's how things are done around here. But I like this particular term here. It's how an organisation behaves when no one is watching. And I think that's quite powerful in the sense when you know you've actually made a change within an organisation and people just do it because that's just how things are done around here. I'd use the example here of when seatbelts were first introduced into motor vehicles, and you probably know this one, Jerome, but I think it was Victoria that first legislated seatbelts in Australia.
That's correct.
Yeah, and I think it was, yeah, and I can remember as a kid, I'm showing my age here, but getting in with my father, and when it was legislated, because I'm originally Mexican, I'm from Melbourne, and I remember getting in the vehicle, my father saying to me, son, it's now law, you got to put your seatbelt on, or we get fined. And so the culture was around, we put this seatbelt on, because if we don't, basically, we could get fined. And I think today, people put their seatbelt on, not because they're going to get fined, but because there's overwhelming research that says that seatbelts save lives. So it's changed in terms of that mindset. People put seatbelts on not because they're going to get fined. I hope people don't anyway. And so we put this seatbelt on because the research and all the accident research that's gone into this has just told us that they actually save lives. So that's an example, I suppose, of how an organisation behaves when no one is watching, and that's the types of principles in APA we want to get to as an organisation, that people do things not because there's a process or procedure or so forth. It's because they truly believe that this is the right thing to do and they understand the why.
So the hearts and minds, crucial part there, is it?
Yeah, very much so. It's that hearts and minds, you know, hearts, minds, and hands and head. I think it's all of it.
I think one of the key parts as well, I can imagine with the amount of mileage that you guys have out and about, you've got people out on the road all the time, and they're very much autonomous. They're on their own, so you want to make sure you got the right, they know what they're doing when they're out there and they're doing it safe.
Yeah, very much so, Jerome. And I can tell a story also. When we first introduced in-vehicle monitoring into our vehicles, I was actually horrified when I started to see the data coming through. And we have made significant changes as a result of that. But not because we just wanted to sort of use the IVMS data as a big stick, but we wanted to actually use it to actually get people to understand the why. And that's really the key around trying to drive culture change. If you don't really clearly articulate the why, it's very hard for people to engage in it. The last little comment there is around, and I provide this presentation at a conference earlier this year with Jerome, and I used the Richmond Football Club. I am from Melbourne, so I do follow Australian rules football, so don't hold that against me. And I also go for the Melbourne Storm and the Rugby League. But anyway, but the president of the Richmond Football Club, Peggy O'Neill, an interesting lady. She is an American lady that came out to Australia as a result. She came here backpacking, really loved Australia, and then decided to actually reside here. And then basically took a real liking to Australian rules football. And cut a long story short, in 2007, the Richmond Football Club were in a lot of strife. Financially, they were in a lot of strife. Culturally, they had a pretty toxic culture. They were poor performing as an AFL club, etc. And Peggy O'Neill, you know, basically got a directorship on the Richmond Football Club. And then eventually she became president of the Richmond Football Club. And one of the first things she did once she became president, she recognised the culture wasn't right, the leadership wasn't right within the Richmond Football Club, and she made some changes. And she really, we had a lot of talent. She said we had a lot of talented footballers and so forth, but the leadership piece was missing, and we weren't really addressing the cultural issues that we really need to address as a leadership team, as you know, as a football club. So by 2017, the Richmond Football Club went on to win the AFL premiership. And as you all probably know, in 2019, which I said I'd done this presentation before the result was known, they won the AFL premiership again. So Peggy O'Neill, I think, you know, if you ever get an opportunity to read some of her background and what she did and so forth, it was quite fascinating from a sporting perspective, how she focused on culture. You know, get the right culture will drive success. Some people might have seen this. It's been around for some time. It was a concept developed by Professor Maureen Dollard. So Maureen, basically, it's very similar to for those that are familiar with the hierarchy of controls, it starts with, you know, in terms of elimination and ends with the lowest form of risk control being personal protective equipment. So what Peggy basically, Maureen basically describes in this model is that right at the top of an organisation, if an organisation is not clear in the leadership around the values of an organisation, then it's hard to get, you know, that safety culture shift. So it's really, really critical in an organisation that they are clear in terms of those values, that leadership actually walk the talk around those values, and they're well communicated throughout the organisation. There's also, in terms of the organisation, in terms of its policies, you know, the commitment, you know, to safety, you know, that's clear within your policy framework, and the supporting systems and processes. And then underlaying that, you have all your support types of functions. So in terms of your learning development, in terms of your training, your recruitment, your management systems, your inductions, your health and wellbeing programs, your EAP support programs. All those are really critical in terms of supporting an organisation in terms of that climate within the organisation. And then you have middle management or the middle management, which are really leading the people in the coalface to ensure that they understand that there's no compromise when it comes to the values, that they're upheld. They're upheld before safety, upheld before production. So safety is actually really the key driver, you know, and I know in APA, we have really worked hard on that particular aspect in terms of putting safety before everything else. And then, you know, the support in terms of the pathways for workers to be able to provide feedback and communicate effectively right back up. And then you have the job design in terms of how work is done rather than imagined. So in terms of the job design, things like your rostering or your shifts that your people are working, things like in terms of flexible worker arrangements, things like, you know, in terms of the equipment and tools and the capability of people in terms of getting the job done. And last of all, you have the worker. So the worker being supported and also being able to be encouraged to speak up about safety. And they feel, you know, that they would be supported in speaking up about safety. So that's you know, sort of quite a little model. It's quite a useful model, you know, to apply as an organisation. So do we have all this, or where are we in terms of as an organisation in terms of our safety climate? And you can get some of that information for those that run employee opinion surveys and then pulse surveys and all those sorts of things that gives you good insight in terms of your climate of your organisation.
Does the diagram, there's a point here from Adam where he's sort of saying, with the exception of the job design layer, doesn't that sort of diagram really just describe reporting structure inside of a business?
No, look, I think it's not a hierarchy of reporting. You know, you could sort of look at it and sort of say, yes, it is a bit of a hierarchy, but it's more than the hierarchy. It's all the things and all the programs and so forth that support the hierarchy. So to be able to, you know, get your climate right, you've got to have, you know, those supporting aspects to it. So it's not just your hierarchy in terms of a structure or organizational design. It's also all those supporting sort of, you know, attributes, if you like, in terms of making it happen, because it just doesn't happen as a result of a hierarchy.
Thanks, Keith.
Yeah. So just moving on in terms of why change our approach or focus around safety culture. What was, you know, I suppose I always say, what was our burning platform, or what's your burning platform? And coming into APA, we didn't have what I'd say a burning platform, but we had situations where high potential near-miss events were occurring. And I say, well, in some cases we're relying on luck. And when you rely on luck, it eventually runs out. So, and I didn't want to be relying on luck. So one of the things we did is a real deep dive in terms of our high potential near-miss events. We had a good reporting culture. And when I say a near-miss reporting event, what am I talking about there? So things like, for example, a person working at heights without fall protection, or for example, a person going in confined space without the necessary gas monitoring, tripods, harnesses, so forth, set up correctly. So a lot of these types of near-miss events that haven't resulted in a serious or fatal injury, but each one of them had the potential to result in one. So this was our burning platform, because we start to look at this, and when we start to really analyze a lot of our high potential near-miss events, what we start to realize, it was pretty, when we couldn't find one that we say, well, could this have been prevented? So it really gave us something in terms of saying, well, I see it as a good lead indicator, you know, in the sense that if you've got this data, and we had a good reporting culture, so that's actually, you know, helped us, because if you didn't have a good reporting culture, you don't generally have this information. So people felt safe to report things and so forth. But what it was saying, we as an organisation were missing opportunities, and we were just waiting for a ticking time bomb for something to actually more sinister or serious to happen. The next one is around in terms of our injury rates. So you can see there, we've had significant reduction in injury rates, from 2010 to 2014. We basically had a significant focus around in terms of what's causing our injuries and getting to some of the lower risk types of stuff as well, in terms of, manual handling, or, in terms of, they're probably the highest type of injury type that we experience with an aging workforce. But some of the other areas in terms of injuries, trips, slips and falls, and cuts to the hands, and all those types of things. So we addressed some of those with some really good targeted programs, but we've still got some work to do. So what I want to say here, but in terms of injury rates, a lot of people try to correlate injury rates back to the fact that we've got to drive injury rates, and we drive injury rates, we've got a good safety culture. And I go back to the Deep Sea Horizon, it's quite a good example, I suppose. The day before that occurred, they were celebrating in terms of they had 0 lost time injuries. Okay, so using the injury rate to say, what, we're doing a great job around safety. And the next day they had the Deep Sea Horizon. So it goes to show that you can't just look at injury rates and say, well, that's what we target in terms of driving our safety culture, and we're going to focus on these things. You need to understand what's the risk in your business, and what are the things that potentially could cause harm or result in serious sort of catastrophic events.
Just a question here from Corey for you on that sort of graph. There's a lot of high point near misses. Does it not also indicate a failing on hazard identification analysis? Just a query from Corey.
It does. It does. It identifies a failure on a number of levels, in a sense that we haven't got things right. We're actually overlooking things. Our fatal risk protocols, which I'll get to actually in the presentation of some of the things we actually have done around that, because it did identify failures in a number of areas in terms of we're having these high potential incidents, and things clearly aren't working the way they should. But you also got to be mindful of that, is that when you do take on this type of work and challenge, you don't drive things underground. Okay, so soon as sometimes you can send the wrong signals and the wrong message into the business, that all of a sudden as people see this as a negative, all right, a negative thing of reporting. And it's really important, when you start to get to this and address these types of areas, is that from an organisational perspective, is that don't drive the culture underground from a reporting perspective. And that's easier said than done. Coming back to the strategy. So our strategy, which I mentioned at the start of the presentation. So our strategy had 7 themes, and the first theme there is our fatal risk protocols. So linking it back to those high potential events. So when we looked at our high potential events, we had, every one of them had a fatal risk associated with them. And some of the other things we found as well is that some of them there was a bit of risk normalization happening in the business. In the sense, when I say risk normalization, people were accepting the risk and not seeing it as potentially a fatal risk. And for example, asset strikes. So we do, on a month, we do over 15,000 dig-ups around Australia. And so with that sort of level of exposure, we were seeing a lot of asset strikes. So high risk asset strikes predominantly being on gas and electricity. And what we were seeing is that the risk rating of those type of events were risk ranked low to medium in some instances. And so straight away, it was recognised this risk normalisation. There's nothing low risk about hitting gas and electricity. So one of the first things we called out in terms of our fatal risk protocols was that any of these events straight away were classified as high risk. Okay, so all of a sudden it sort of put a great more focus from a risk perspective. So fatal risk protocols, I used the example of Stephen Covey. So it's a well-known book, Stephen Covey, in a program, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And Stephen Covey talks about, in life, you need to get your priorities, your high priorities, what are they? And if you don't address your high priorities, then you'll go through life perhaps not achieving the things that you really want to achieve. So for us in APA, our highest priority was our fatal risk protocols. And if you ever go, this is going back to my days at school, if you ever go to fill up a jar with sort of rocks, and if you don't get the big ones in first, you probably won't get them in. So we use this as saying, well, our fatal risk is our big rock. This is the one we want to focus on, and this is the platform we use to help us to drive cultural change and answering that why, you know, and people can relate to it. So some of the things we did, for example, with fatal risks, is that we looked at, going back to that question around hazard identification, we really start to examine a lot of our processes around how well that was being applied. In terms of our investigations, how well have we trained people in incident investigations? And we found that probably not as good as we should have. We found our incident methodology wasn't as robust as it should have been. We also established a working group or a governance group around fatal risks, you know, so representation and with subject matter experts around the fatal risks. So with an APA, we've got 9, we've identified what we call our fatal risks. And they range from, you know, excavation and trenching to working in confined spaces, to working at heights, to energy isolation, etc. So we have 9 fatal risks. Establishing that working group and governance group, we're able then to really start to target the types of initiatives. And one of the ones we did roll out just recently on the fatal risk protocols, and I showed the video at the last presentation on this, and unfortunately can't do it over the webinar at the moment, but we use storytelling. And as kids, we're brought up as, you know, on storytelling. And, you know, really, you know, people like a good story. You know, we always like to hear a really good story, and we always remember a really good story as well. So we use storytelling to actually convey some tragic events that our leaders had come across in their careers, and using storytelling to get a message out, but we just didn't use it just to get the message out. We then used a program, and it wasn't a highly over complex program, but getting people after that leader telling that story, and it might have been, for example, one of our leaders telling a story of a fatality in a confined space and how it happened and so forth. And, you know, you can see it's still raw, and the person telling the story is reliving, you know, that situation. And people afterwards, you know, really say, oh, I get the why around this. This is really powerful. You know, sometimes we just think we've got to do these things because it's in a procedure and process. But when you see something like that, it really makes you think. And we use that to actually help educate our people around, well, what are the controls? What are the risk controls that we need to make sure we're putting in place around our fatal risks to make sure they actually are fully implemented? So that gives you just an example. There's a lot of other themes there, which we won't have time to go through today, but we basically, you know, really use that fatal risk platform to help us with our cultural shift. We also, with our leadership around the leadership belief equation, so leadership drive culture, and we said we need to make sure we spend time with our leaders and educating our leaders, and we've done a lot of work on leadership programs with an APA. And if you get the leadership right, you can actually then start to impact on the behaviours of people and generally performance. So we got our leaders to really, you know, put them through some extensive programs. We had, you know, 360s done on their leadership ability, leadership programs that we've rolled across the organisation. So we've done a lot of work with our leadership in getting the importance of it, and it's led from right up from our top, from our CEO MD all the way through. So leaders are clearly accountable and know what they're accountable for, and that's really important, you know, in terms of driving that culture, is that you have that leadership engaged. And also accountable for it as well. Any questions?
We've actually got quite a few questions have come in, Keith. What I might do though is we'll keep moving through, because I know you still got quite a few slides left, and then I'll hold the questions over through to the end, if that's all right.
Well, no worries. Okay, so look at in terms of the approach we use for change in APA. So I know we're a little bit pressed for time here. So this is pretty much, you know, how we approached an APA. So we identified the key elements that would move us as an organisation. We considered we were really a compliant type of organisation, and we wanted to move out of that compliance sort of space and really focused, as I mentioned before, on leadership. And to do that, we did a lot of analysis in terms of looking at the culture within the organisation. We used a modified version of Patrick Hudson, which you mentioned before, Jerome, the Hearts and Minds. And we also used the DuPont Safety Maturity Model, which has been around for some time, and it's still quite a good model. It gives you a bit of a benchmark and a draw a line in the sand and where you may be in terms of your safety maturity. We then also customised and established some assessment criteria. So we identified the key attributes. So this was a customised tool. So the customised tool, we actually, with our leaders, what are the key attributes around leadership and commitment? And what are the sorts of safety behaviours from leaders as well? So we really sort of developed those supporting tools and that criteria that they could actually do robust assessments against with their teams and their workers. We held workshops with our people, and we're still continuing to do this. So this is not job done yet. We're still continuing to do a lot of this work as we speak. So running these workshops and with our leaders undertaking their own self-assessments and actually establishing their own baseline within their own areas. And it's interesting when you start to do that sort of work, and getting the feedback from their own people and actually challenging some of the norms, and also saying, you know what, do we do that consistently? Do we constantly, for example, if we have an incident that's basic from investigation, there's a lessons learned, do we publish and do we promote and do we communicate that lessons learned, and do we do it on a consistent perspective? So it was really quite worthwhile doing these. It does take time, it does take commitment, but we are starting to see a shift, a significant shift in terms of the culture within the organisation as a result of this work. And then from those workshops, each work group will have their own plans. So it's customised and it's a plan for their own work group. And they can actually look at it and say, it's not some generic plan, it's actually they've been involved in it and they've had skin in the deal in developing that. And then we monitor it and track it. And then we come back and do another workshop. So it's an ongoing sort of process, but it's actually, for us at APA, we're actually starting to see some really good results coming out of this sort of approach. And there's I suppose, the safety, or it's called the Bradley curve, or the hybrid of the safety maturity model. So one end of the spectrum, you've got reactive, and right at the end of the other end of the spectrum is independent. So reactive is, pretty much when things happen, we do something around safety. And right at the other end, independent, well, teams actually take ownership and believe. And hence, in terms of our workshops around the team element, getting teams to believe and own and take ownership is really important. That accountability, once again, that was really clear. We had to make sure our leaders understood that, what they were accountable for, and holding them accountable. And, accountability sometimes can come with some serious consequences when people don't live up to those requirements. And we've had to make, as an organisation, like a lot of other organisations, we've had to let some of our leaders go because they weren't living the values, they weren't living what was required of them as a leader, and they weren't being highly accountable. So in some instances, we've had to make some hard decisions, technically competent people, but unfortunately, in terms of where we want to head as an organisation, we need that leadership, right? So this is really important about those clear accountabilities within the business.
And how do you get your leaders at your level all buying into what you're trying to do, Keith?
Yeah, look, I suppose it makes it a little bit easier when you've got a CEO, an MD, and a board that are very active in this area. The old saying, sometimes what interests my boss fascinates me. When you've got a senior leadership team that are determined and committed, and a CEO, an MD, and a board that are quite visible, and we've got a board that actually goes out to our work sites. We have board meetings on work sites, for example. When you've got a highly committed leadership team, it makes your job a hell of a lot easier. Where you don't, and that's where I say, if you go back to the climate model, if you're targeting workers in terms of your strategy, if you're targeting line management and you don't have your senior leadership right, and you haven't got your senior leadership on board, I'd say to get this shift would probably become, I would say, pretty much impossible. So my key messages here is you've really got to start influencing and getting buy-in and create, in some cases, create a bit of a burning platform. Because once you start putting in front of people saying, you know what, we're just luckier, we were very close to actually having a fatal event. How would you like, what would you feel in terms of your son or daughter coming to work in our work environment? Would you feel that this is the right, safe work environment for them? So when you start to get into that, those emotional type of conversations with people, people generally start to engage. So yeah, it's a good question, Jerome, but the leadership piece, I keep coming and I'm harping on it, but it's absolutely critical. And we're, like I said, you know, this is just an example in terms of the visual leadership and in the tool that I was talking about. You may not be able to see it all that good, but the criteria that we use in terms of assessing, in terms of our safety culture and our maturity as an organisation, and in continuing to target that. And then, you know, moving to what are the measures we're using. So we're using measures, and culture is not something you can actually really measure, but there's some indicators that give you some insight in terms of how you're actually, as an organisation, how you're generally tracking or so forth. And you'd expect to see, in terms of if you're starting to do some really good work around this area, you would start to see some of your, for example, your lag performance indicators showing improvement. You would start to see better, engagement of your people in terms of survey results and so forth. So we've used a number of tools. We've used maturity assessment. So using that tool, the visual leadership is one element, and there's a whole heap of elements. With the work teams, they were able to plot in terms of their own score, if you like. So it gives them a bit of an assessment. It's not, rocket science. It's not, perfect, but it gives them a bit of a, view of where they might be in terms of, their own maturity assessment. And they can also benchmark that against other work teams and they have some really, if anything, it starts with some really good conversations. We continue to track our high potential incidents. So that's a key feature, keeping an eye on in terms of those high potentials, and are we actually seeing, reduction in our high potentials. Driving is probably one of our key fatal risks. And recently we just introduced a driver scorecard. So using our IVMS data, and drivers are able to get their own personal scorecard in terms of how they sort of are driving. And they're actually, it creates a bit of competitive environment. So, workers will sometimes say, well, how are you going? What's your driving score look like? So it creates a bit of a competitive environment. Using engagement and pulse surveys across the organisation. Bit of focus, like I said, we do a lot of dig ups and so forth on our asset strike incidents, and using workshops, as I mentioned, in terms of running those workshops right across the organisation and keeping that momentum going is really important. And the last slide here, we've got then some time for questions. It's just quickly going through our health and wellbeing plan. So we've named our health and wellbeing plan BOUNCE, being aspire, participate and achieve is the key words. And it's not one, with health and wellbeing, you can drive it as a compliance program. It's really more of an engagement program and creating an environment for people to do something for their own health and wellbeing. So it's a very much one around trying to provide people with the right information, give them the right resources so they can actually then take action for their own health and wellbeing. Some of the things we've done is for example, we launched a customised health and wellbeing portal. So all our people have access to that portal. They can also organise to have their own health assessments undertaken in confidence, and it's completely confidential. And those health assessments, we do get some of that data. We don't know, it's de-identified, so we don't know where it's coming from. But what it gives us some insights in terms of some of the health conditions of our employees, what's the health risks to some of our employees. So it gives us some insight of the sorts of programs that we would like to target as far as our health and wellbeing program. And we have all sorts of other programs right throughout the year. We support Black Dog, a lot of other sort of programs that we support throughout the year. And we have sort of annual sort of programs around, for example, we just recently had walking the Moomba to Sydney pipeline, a virtual reality walk, and trying to get our people, coming, it's a bit of fun and getting them engaged in terms of keeping their steps up and so forth. So once again, it's an important part of our overall strategy, the health and well-being of our people, and it's sometimes underestimated how important that actually is. Look, and that's pretty much the presentation, Jerome, and we've got some time for questions.
Mate, I think that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, and we've got some good themes coming through, so I'll dive into some of these questions. One here from Adam. Given that you work in an industry with a very real risk of truly catastrophic instruments, do you think that the incidents that are causing lost time are actually indicative of the management of hazards that cause catastrophic events?
Yeah, look, it's very hard to answer that, because sometimes you could say some of our first aid injuries, it was only luck that it didn't result in a catastrophic event. So it really comes back to the circumstance around the incident. So, an incident may result, the incident in terms of an injury is only a categorization of what's happened to somebody. It's not an indicator of safety performance. And this is what I said before in that slide. There's a lot of organisations use injury rates to say, well, this is around how we're performing as an organisation, and it's not if you're not looking at it from a risk lens. So it's really important. I think it's a good question, because it's really important that you focus on, in terms of what is behind this, what's our understanding, and could this result in a catastrophic event? It was only luck that prevented it. So good quality investigations are really critical.
Great answer. And a couple of your scorecards touched on a few things. So a question here from Caroline, Stephen, and Adam. So can you share more about your road safety scorecards? And just going a bit further, are you any evidence around the driver scorecard correlating with reduced crash rates?
No, look, I've got no evidence to back it up in terms of the scorecard reducing. And as I sort of mentioned, this is something new we've just recently, when I say new, we introduced it this year. And the sorts of things, the metrics, is pretty much the types of data that we get out of IVMS. So in terms of speeding, harsh collision taking, harsh braking, all those types of metrics. And we've set up what we think is a bit of a benchmark, and it's not perfect by no means, but it's just like culture. You can't actually measure culture, but you can actually start to potentially put in some indicators and just see what's that doing. But what I can actually say, categorically say, is that since we've started doing the scorecards, one of the things we've really noticed is we've seen a significant reduction in terms of speeding events. Okay, so that in itself, I think, if you know that speed, and that has been verified from all the research, that speed is one of them, if not the number one killer in terms of on our roads. And by actually getting people to drive safely, and that's been through a driver scorecard, by giving that information and not using it as a big stick. I'm not saying that we'd never use it as a big stick, but we want to use it as more as an education tool and use it to try to change some of the behaviour around driving. So in that instance, I can categorically say the driver scorecard has actually seen a significant reduction in speeding events coming through our IVMS data.
Oh, great. Question here from Ron. Let me just scroll up to it. Ron, heavy vehicle drivers are managed by fatigue management laws. Does APA apply some fatigue systems for heavy and light drivers, or do they differ?
No, we do, absolutely. So we don't have a big exposure when it comes to heavy vehicles. We do have a heavy vehicle fleet, but it's not a large heavy vehicle fleet. But over in, say, for example, in West Australia, it covers every vehicle. So absolutely, it's one of our fatal risk protocols is fatigue. It makes up one of those 9. And we also, basically, have through our IVMS and journey plans. So we require any person traveling, in remote or outside of metropolitan areas as well, we require people to complete journey plans. And that's a journey plan is part of a centralized controls. So we have a centralized control center that monitors that. And we actually really sort of enforce that requirement. So it is part of our, once again, when you talk about safety culture, people know that if you're traveling into a sort of a metropolitan area, you will need a journey plan, and we monitor fatigue and so forth through those journey plans.
Great. And last question, I'm going to combine two from Corey and Claire. You have such a fragmented, isolated workforce. What's the best method of engagement, and what sort of practical tips do you have for creating a safety culture around workplace travel and organisational development?
It is a challenge. When you have a geographically spread workforce, which we do, it does require a lot of use of technology, in places where we can't get to on a regular basis. So it does require that. It does require our leaders, to travel. A fair bit of our leaders do a fair bit of travel. So getting out to our sites, using, emails and so forth. We have Workface by Facebook, so we use those sorts of communication channels. So real-time communication to get messages out. Through SMS messaging and all those other sorts of technology-enabled types of things we can do. So, but it is a challenge where you've got a very dispersed, geographically spread workforce in sometimes moving into remote and isolated types of environments.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Keith. We've sort of come up on our time now, so thank you very much to our audience. Thank you to everyone who's participated and provided questions. I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to get through them all. Thank you very much, Keith. Would you like to have one last closing comment and we're done?
Yeah, look, and I'll just thank everybody for staying tuned and enjoyed some of the questions. And by all means, any further questions, happy to address them, take them offline.
Great, and I'll do that. We'll go through the list for those who have not, whose questions weren't answered. I'll pass them on to Keith, and we'll do a follow-up. So thank you all again, and please tune in for future webinars and have a lovely day. Thank you.